Every one of us, throughout our earthly lifetime, has been given, through our experiences, those who've influenced us, a perspective on life itself. That is called, commonly, a worldview. It's very interesting how we view our lives, how we view our experiences, and what we learn that we should not learn, and don't learn that we should learn. Whether you have seen the movie or not, most of us in this room, if not all of us, are well aware of the classic statement made by Tom Hanks in the movie when he said, "Life is like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get." That's true. None of us can predict what's around the corner. And quite often, tomorrow is going to bring us tears. Irving Berlin said it this way: life is like an onion. You peel it layer by layer, and sometimes you just have to weep. In a sense, there are two major worldviews when it comes to looking at life as a whole and dividing it into its various segments, sections, or chapters. Fatalism, which is a common view of many people, basically says life has no purpose. It has no meaning. It has no ultimate explanation. George Santayana of Harvard University said it this way concerning life and time: why shouldn't things be largely absurd, futile, transitory? They are so, just as we are. Both they and we go well together. Joseph Crutch, who taught at Columbia University in New York, a naturalist, said it this way: there is no reason to suppose that a man's life has any more meaning than an insect. When we pick the Bible up, in order to ultimately come to Jesus Christ, a person begins somewhere along the way to recognize there is a God and that life is designed by God with an ultimate objective. We call that a God-centered worldview. That is summarized, if you have your Bibles open, in Ecclesiastes chapter 3. And notice, if you will, verse number 9 and verse 10. What profit has the worker from that in which he labors? I have seen the God-given task with which the sons of men are to be occupied. The text is very simply saying, in street language today, God has given every one of us multiple chapters of life. Those chapters of life are intended to drive us to our knees and to draw us to God. Life is not a series of accidents. It is a series of divine appointments. Why were you born now and not 100 years ago? In my case, why was my father killed in an industrial accident when I was an 8-year-old boy and raised as an orphan? Why did I spend 3 years in various foster homes and 2 years in an orphanage? Why was I raised in poverty by my grandmother without an inside bathroom, inside heat, cook stove, running water? Why did I go off to Bible college and struggle to get through Bible college? And how did I end up at Grandville Bible Church in Grandville, Michigan? Those are very logical and important questions each of us ask in our various experience. We often view life in cycles. We think of childhood and infancy, when a baby is learning to walk, learning to talk, just beginning to live. We look at an education cycle, which covers a period from 5 or 6 up until a child finishes high school, goes on to college, begins a career. We think of young adulthood, when the 3 most important decisions in life are made. Who will I marry? What will I do for my career? And what will the purpose of my life be? We think of the early stages of marriage, when a man and woman begin to have children, and life is all of a sudden thrown into the chaos of raising a family while trying to earn a living. We think of a stage of life when you're climbing the ladder of success and achieving your highest position in life with your highest financial possibilities you will ever achieve. And then we reach the peak. And from that plateau, we began a process of decline. That's linearly how we view life. Solomon takes the world's view of life, which is fatalism, and Solomon is going to take us through a series of experiences. Those experiences are all characterized as a time, a chapter, a scene, a period. You may not realize it, and we have to be careful if we do. This is poetic. And quite often when we read poetry, I hate to read poetry because my natural tendency is to sing song. I want to make it music. And poetry is not always music. But in this poem that we read this morning, a time, 14 different pairs of opposites are brought together. Solomon, in drawing this picture, is not attempting to lay out an order as much as he is attempting to lay out a contrast. Life is a series of experiences that don't always go together. My wife was unsaved until 1 year before she decided to go to Bible college. I had been saved, went to high school, and from high school into Bible college. And in my senior year, I met a young lady who was from Michigan who had only been saved months. And she actually had come to Bible college to learn the Bible. Who would ever believe that in the sovereignty of God, those two people would become husband and wife? Wasn't she fortunate? I know I was. I am. In life, Solomon begins to lay out a perspective for us. A perspective that I think it's critical for us to realize. God is using every one of these odd scenes to accomplish something in his end. But none of us can fully understand where God is going. None of us completely have the end figured out. In fact, that is stated in our text. Notice verse 11 for just a moment. In verse number 11, Solomon says, he has made everything beautiful. The word translated beautiful, if you have a New American Standard, does a better job of giving us the current understanding of beauty. Beauty can be attractive, or beauty can finally make sense of a picture. And the New American Standard Version takes the Hebrew word and translates it appropriate. He has made everything appropriate, beautiful in the sense of properly placed. He has made everything beautiful in his time. And he has put eternity in their hearts, except that no man can find out the work that God does from beginning to end. My wife was in the kitchen last evening. As she was standing at the counter, and our kitchen and our family room are together in one unit, I was doing some work on the computer, And I was watching her put this in a bowl and put that in a bowl and put another in the bowl. And I said to her, "What are you doing?" She said, "I'm making supper." I sat down a little while later, and it was a great supper, but I couldn't figure out what she was doing. And quite often, when God is at work in our lives, we don't know where He's going. One of the biggest mistakes that is made is the mistake of, whether believer or unbeliever, to figure out tomorrow today. Do you understand that Jesus gave us the proper perspective when He said in Matthew chapter number 6, when we asked the question about tomorrow, here's how He responded: "Sufficient unto the day is the evil thereof." You've got enough problems to carry with today without trying to pick up tomorrow's possibilities and try and figure it all out. You see, the root of the problem is we have difficulty trusting God. We can trust God with eternity, we say, but we can't trust God with time. Some things happen in our life and we look back on them and say, why did it go this way instead of that way? Why did this happen instead of that happening? Why did it have to be? What is the reason? And Solomon, in giving us this passage, is reminding us you have two ways of looking at life. You can look at it fatalistically and just simply say, I'm going to grin and bear it, or I'm going to grit my teeth and bear it. I'm just going to get through it the best way I can. Or, to everything, there is a time and purpose. Psalm 31, my times are in your hands. And the other option is to say, God, nothing ever happens as an accident in the life of a believer. No matter what it is, at its best or its worst, a sovereign God permitted or purposely ordered, and since He permits, He purposely ordered it in my life. There is something God wanted to accomplish with the negative, with the adverse, with the tragic, with the confusion, with the chaos. God is always at work. And Solomon lays a very simple foundation for us, beginning in verse number 2. Looking at life as a series of entirely opposite experiences, he begins with a basic foundational understanding. A time to be born and a time to die. If you think about it for a moment, none of us contributed to the timing of our birth. To use the expression the Hebrews would have used, we were all in the loins of our father. Nobody asked if we wanted to be born into this family at this time in history. God, in His sovereignty, placed us in a particular situation because out of that foundational experience was going to come His ultimate purpose in our lives. Most of you who regularly attend here know that my mother was schizophrenic. It ran in the family bloodline, in the family that she came from. She married my father when she was 16. My wife and I only found out that I was born after they were married when we went for a marriage certificate. I thought I was born out of wedlock all of my childhood. I found out, no, you weren't at all. They were married 2 years. Why did a man who was in the Merchant Marines marry a woman who was schizophrenic at 16? And when they were married, they didn't live in Dallas with her family or Atlanta area with his family. They lived in New Orleans. You didn't know I was from Bourbon Street, did you? Why that kind of beginning? I don't have all the answers yet. Not only that, I have a brother who fell madly in love with a young girl. 35 years ago, he walked into the backyard and sat in front of a chair, a lawn chair in front of a tree, pulled a shotgun out, blew his heart out. Why? Why those circumstances? Bill, why couldn't you have just backed off? Why couldn't you have talked to us? It never took God by surprise. There was no surprise element to God. So Solomon is really laying a foundation, and the foundation is this. You don't determine the day of your birth, and you won't determine the day of your death. I look out over this room. I can tell that many of us have lived 70. Some of us look like we've lived 70. I don't mean that negative. I've known people who at the end of their life were saying continuously, here was the echoing question, why does God let me live? Why doesn't God let me die? What in the sovereign purpose of God is the reason for the two extremes? Solomon takes those as his foundation, and he walks us through the major chapters of life. Not chronologically, not cyclically, but experientially. Most of these, many of us in this room have actually gone through. Notice, if you will, please, he tells us, there is a time to plant and a time to pluck. A farmer generally in the spring plants and generally in the fall harvest. That's not always true, and it's not true everywhere, but it's generally true as we understand it. What if the farmer decides, I don't want to plant in the spring, I want to harvest in the spring, I want to plant in the fall and hope my corn and beans will make it through the winter? You cannot resist nature. The laws of nature were in place before the farmer ever came to the field. And the farmer, in order to fulfill his purpose, has to learn to cooperate with what God is doing. Blackaby, the famous Southern Baptist Bible teacher, revivalist, and often philosopher, says this: we must learn what is God doing and learn cooperate with it. There are people who spend their entire life determined, I don't care what God wants, I want. I don't care what God's will is, my will is. I don't care what the divine plan is, my plan is. And all their life, they say they trust God. But all their life, they're fighting God. The person who learns to enjoy life realizes the key to living life is responding, not reacting. It is not taking control, it is yielding control. It is not determining alone, but seeking to find submissively what he alone has marked out. Warren Wiersbe says this: the man of faith always learns what God is doing and seeks to cooperate. To live life with a God-centered worldview, I don't tell God what he's doing. I let God tell me what he's doing. And God won't tell me any more than I will tell a child that wants to rebel. Dad, could I have permission too? Why do you want permission? Well, this is what I want to you don't want permission to do what I want. You want to open the door for what you want. The answer is no. Many times as parents, we withheld information from our children. We didn't lie to them, but we didn't tell them everything we knew. Because we knew if they knew what we know, it would endanger them. And out of our love for them, we purposely kept them in the dark. And God does the same thing in the seasons of life. And planting and plucking illustrate that. Notice, if you will, please, Solomon takes us to one of the most difficult scenes of life. He says there's a time to kill and a time to heal. Someone has well said that most of life is either a battlefield or it is a hospital. How many times have wars caused multitudes of people to be killed, and then the Red Cross and other organizations step in the scene to help heal those who were injured? A policeman on the job shoots his gun, a criminal is injured. The nurses and doctors come to the aid of the criminal so they can turn around and bring him back to court to be tried and ultimately sentenced to death. Does that make sense? Not from a fatalistic standpoint. But with God in mind, there is a reason for it all. Solomon tells us there's a time to break down and a time to build up. I grew up just out of Atlanta, Georgia. And when I grew up, Atlanta, Georgia was a city of about 500,000 people, whole metropolitan area. If my family today goes from Michigan to visit our family that is in Florida, we dread driving through Atlanta more than any other place that we have to drive through. Thank you, Ernie. Why? Because what was a city of 500,000, unlike Chicago, blocked by Lake Michigan, Detroit, Lake Huron, New York, the Atlantic Ocean, Los Angeles, the Pacific Ocean, Atlanta has had the possibility of becoming the super information center for the highway of the U.S. And as a result, Atlanta has exploded in the last 40 or 50 years. Today, what used to be a 4-lane highway is a 12-lane highway, and we need another 5 lanes just to get through the city. Urbanization creates construction, but it also creates destruction. Roads are built and then torn up for skyscrapers. Skyscrapers are built and then torn down immediately in urban progress for higher skyscrapers, better skyscrapers. And we live in a world and we say to ourselves, it doesn't make sense. The reason is because the government is behind it all. Solomon goes on to tell us there is a time for us, notice if you will please in verse number 4, to weep and a time to laugh. It's been described for pastors that they have the most emotionally difficult experience in all of the world. In no other career do you begin the day by walking into a hospital and dealing with someone who is dying. And before the day is over, you're called back to the hospital or to another hospital for the birth of a baby. And then in the evening, you meet with a couple who are having marital problems. Life has some very unusual chapters. We weep at death. We rejoice at birth. I can't control what emotions life is going to bring me. Circumstances are in control of that, and I have no choice. I can't say, I'm in the mood today to laugh. I'm in a down mood. I'm ready to cry. I have absolutely no part in ordering life in its direction to me. Notice, if you will, please, Solomon goes on to say this. He says, there's a time to mourn and a time to dance. Now, I realize Solomon didn't attend a church like ours, or he wouldn't mention dancing. But each of us knows Solomon illustrated for us how close joy and sorrow can be together. Come with me to the city of Jerusalem. The Ark of the Covenant is being brought into the city on a cart. And as the Ark is being brought into the city, a man by the name of Uzzah reaches his hand up, and God kills him on the spot. Only the Levites were permitted to carry the ark, and in a specific manner. David weeps over the death of Uzzah. David rejoices when the ark is taken into the temple. And so you have joy and sorrow so close together, but I don't have any choice. Some of us look at our lives and we see our lives as I once was joyful, but now I'm in the sorrowing stage of life. I've known elderly people who have been mourning for years. Yes. I had to leave work. When I left work because of retirement, I lost my identity as a person. I lost income as a person. I lost friends and found myself becoming isolated. I came home and my wife and I, who had been traveling two different directions, were now in one another's hair. I found that my health began to decline. My wife or I began to lose our minds. My wife doesn't have to worry about the word beginning. For me, she knows it's already happening. And finally, one dies to leave the other. Isn't that an amazing way to end such a wonderful life experience? There are people who spend their entire lifetimes building up income with one goal in mind. I'm not going to end that way. That will not be the end of my life. I have news for you. A sovereign God can take it all away just like that. You see, the way we measure life is the problem. We have assumptions about how life is, assumptions about how life should be. And Solomon is attempting to remind us, you know what? Maybe one of the root problems we have is we think we can control life. And we haven't learned the lesson that we tried to teach our children. No, you cannot walk yet. No, you cannot ride the bike yet. No, you cannot go to school. No, you cannot have a car. No, it's not time to date. And we still are dealing with the same problem in the final chapters of life. Because we have never recognized living life is not about control. It's about response. When I was younger, I don't know anyone in my world who was as impatient as I was. There are many reasons that may have been. I don't have an answer to all of them. But I can tell you one of them. If I could get ahead, I could have control. If I could have control, I could protect myself. And we have built an entire culture on that principle. And Solomon is reminding us that our entire worldview is a pagan worldview. It is not a biblical worldview. We call it the Western mindset. It is called around the world the American mindset. You won't find it by the nomadic peoples of the Mideast. You won't find it among the natives who are in Africa. You won't find it in the common villages throughout Russia and China and those other nations around the world. And a very important lesson that Solomon puts before us is we make the mistake of believing we actually can control our destiny. Whether it is the century in which we are born, the family into which we are born, the nation into which we are born, the circumstances into which we are born, we are placed in a world that is going to continuously be at us. And Solomon wants us to learn some very simple lessons. Let me mention those to you this morning. Number one, you and I need to learn to respect the rhythms of life. By the rhythms of life, I mean there are certain things that just don't go with certain periods of life. For example, I recently mentioned, I think it was on a Sunday evening, but I mentioned there was a period of time, a number of years ago, but not when I was a young man, that I wanted to have a convertible car. I mean, after all, how many 55-year-old men have had a convertible? I never had a Corvette. I didn't ask for one. My wife decided that she'd teach me a lesson, and we went on a vacation, and she got one of these vehicles that has the top that comes back. After trying to carry on a conversation, I decided forget the convertible. I can't hear her anyway. We are in a world that technology is ruining our ability to live life. Let me illustrate what I'm talking about. Electricity, as good as it is, has blurred the boundary between day and night. We try to run a 24-hour day when we were designed for a, generally speaking, 12-hour day. And find out we don't have time for this and time for that. And what gets lost, think about it, what gets lost are not the things I want to do, but the essentials of life. Basic relationships get thrown under the bus. It's the natural, inevitable result. Because life is designed with a systematic approach. God divided the year to 365 days. He divided those days into 24-hour increments, and those 24-hour increments into two 12-hour segments, and even further divided it beyond that. And the person who really understands and believes God is sovereign in life doesn't try to take life and give more here than should be given, and take from there because this is what I prefer. That's not my hot button. Not only has electricity ruined us, so has technology. Some of us can remember a time you couldn't go to a gas station 24/7. You couldn't go to the grocery store at midnight and do your shopping. What we have learned is it doesn't matter what the clock says. What matters to me is I want to do what I want to do when I want to do it. And Solomon says, you go ahead and you live that way. But what you're about to find out is you're tearing at your own fiber as a person. God didn't create the world one way and man another way. God created us to operate within the corridors of time, and quite often we are destroying ourselves and this culture by the fact that we're unwilling to recognize this is not natural. Some of us fail to embrace the seasons of life. Those of you who know what I'm about to speak of, please don't speak. What do you do when a man is 65 years of age and decides he wants to marry and have a child? It happens. Life is divided into certain periods, and those periods are to be characterized by practical things. There are some things, to be honest with you, if I could, I'd love to do them. And the moment that my mind goes to say, I want to do that, I want to go back and I want to enjoy my youth again. I didn't experience things other people experienced. Part of it by circumstances under which I had no control. Part of it by bad choices I made. And God says to me, Tom, a 70-year-old man cannot do what a 25-year-old man can do. Yeah, God, you're right. It's just stupid. It's foolish. But even worse, notice if you would, sometimes life turns against us. In my mind, COVID was a time reversal. In my mind, what is going on in the economy is a time reversal. I don't try to stop it. I can't. I don't try to change it. You know what I do? God, you could stop it. You could deliver. Since you don't, I am not going to. You're God, I'm not. But I know people that fight. That's all they know. And the result is they are frustrated. Those around them are frustrated. And not a single thing happens with all the fighting. Because the reality is, God is outside of time. I am in the corridors of time. I have no choice. And so I must learn some basic lessons about how to live life. Notice verse 9. Two particular questions our text asks. Verse 9, notice if you will. Solomon asks the question, what profit has the worker from that in which he labors? Why in a time corridor would Solomon ask the question, what's the profit of my work? Two illustrations. One, all of us can think of. A farmer plants. He cultivates. He spends months getting the soil and the seed ready for a harvest. And in a period of 30 days, at the wrong time, drought comes and there's absolutely no harvest. What is he going to do? As a father, I raise my children. I have certain goals, certain dreams, certain expectations. Some are godly and some are not necessarily ungodly, but they're not what God plans for them. And I spend my years of watching them as adults frustrated because it wasn't what I had planned. Solomon says, you go ahead and fight God. You go ahead and put your foot down. You go ahead and plant your mark. You go ahead and set your boundaries. But let me tell you one thing. You're about to find out that all of your control will not guarantee a thing. There's no profit in it. We have to learn to live life to the glory of God, regardless of circumstances. Billy Graham spoke at Southern Seminary, and he made this statement. He said, the greatest surprise to me has been the brevity of life. If someone had told me when I was 20 that life would be very short, I wouldn't believe it. And you don't either. But I'm here to tell you, time flies. There's never enough time. Time always slips through our finger. We have to find a way to take care of things that we find time pressed for. We feel guilty that we don't have more time. We feel time is running out. Time is elusive because we are a creature, not the Creator. We set arbitrary deadlines, not God's deadlines, our deadlines. I remember back in 1973 when I made a decision. You don't give God a deadline and call it faith in God. What you're doing is attempting to force the hand of God, and you don't tell God what to do, you don't tell God how to do it, and you don't tell God when to do it. And Solomon says, all of that effort can come to zero. And then he asks the second question. Notice, if you would please, verse number 11. He says, beginning in verse number 10, I have seen the God-given task with which the sons of men are to be occupied. What do all of these odd chapters do? Planting season, and it looks like it's dry. God, please send the rain. Harvesting season, and it looks like it's wet. God, I need dry ground. The family is outgrowing the house, and we need construction. We need to add an addition. God, I need income. We find ourselves at a place that we are in a house that has become a master. It's too big for us, and we need some smaller facilities. Deconstruction. God, please help us to sell the home. Every odd chapter in life is God's invitation to get on your knees. All of them are a call from God. Every single thing listed here, the possibility of war. What do you do when you read in the newspaper that, give me a moment to think, for a change, that the Taliban is now demanding billions of dollars from the World Bank and all the nations of the world. For what purpose? To destroy the West. What do you think the purpose is? So what are you going to do? Oh, I'm going to send money to the government so the government can... Well, never mind. I won't send money to the government. What am I going to do? I'm going to get on my knees. Because war can be stopped by God. Peace can come by God. You see, the truth of the matter is we spend too much time here and far too little time here. Prayer in the Bible is not something the early church was organized for. Look at the Bible and see how many times they had public prayer meetings. Almost never. But prayer is what the early church was characterized by. They knew what it was to spend time on their knees before the throne of God, talking with God about what's going on and yielding to God. And it happens on the knees, not with the hands. I pick the Bible up, and all of a sudden I come to the realization that one of the things God is doing is driving me to dependence upon Him with circumstances I can't take care of. Many of you know this. You may have forgotten it. Some of you have never heard of it. But I pastored a church in Illinois that when I walked in, I'd been there just a little bit of time and found out they were in terrible financial condition. $10,000 in past due unpaid bills. And for years, the church had been given a financial report. You know what it was? A bank statement. Church didn't even know where they were financially. How it happened, I'll never know. But the church allowed itself to be put in that position. And then the church owed $170,000 on the spot for a bond program. You say, what did you do? First thing I did. The second thing I did. The last thing I did. We spent time on our knees for the next year. And I'm here to tell you, on the deadline when the last penny was due, God sent $30,000 in at the last moment. Did He not? Unexpected source. We spend too much time here, too little time here. Too much time here, too little time there. God uses these chapters to drive us to Himself. One day, every one of us are going to die. Tombstones normally will carry a name, a date of birth, and a date of death. And then they will carry this. That's your life. That's everything you've worked for. The money you've earned, the name you've gained, the family you've had, the success you've had, the name that you've established for yourself, all of that reduced to this. And 2 generations from now, you won't be remembered. And all the stuff that we spend our lives on, unimportant. Because the proper way to view our lives is we have one step in time and one step in eternity. And there is no other way to look at time. I don't invite an eternal God into time. God works in time. What I do that's the contrast is I suddenly step from time to an eternal perspective, and I recognize that time is not here isolated. Time is the threshold of eternity. God is already at work in my life as a believer. I'm not waiting for His work. I am in His work. And if He's failing right now, and by failing I mean I'm not cooperating, that's not God's fault. Solomon reminds us, verse 11, He has made everything appropriate in its time. We ask the question, why? Why would God give Tom Couch a call to preach with his background? I can tell you right now, Tom Couch, looking at the same background, would never choose it. Why would God give Tom Couch a wife who had only been saved months, who came to Tennessee Temple to get a Bible education? I know the answer to that one. You wouldn't know how many times living with someone who came from the kingdom of darkness to the kingdom of light as I began the ministry kept me on my toes to recognize, is that biblical or is that personal? Because I'm here to tell you Christianity is filled with all kinds of garbage that isn't at all biblical. But the church believes it. But the church teaches it. But the pastor said it. Yeah, and I've said plenty of things that I've regretted. Because the reality is, this is eternal. Forever, O Lord, thy word is settled in heaven. This is final. This is not. This is probing, occupying humanity with how is God going to take the ugliness of our life, the guilt of our life, the failure of our life, the agony of our life, the confusion of our life, the cross circumstances of our life. How is God going to make that appropriate tomorrow? We know that all things work together for good to those who love God and are the called according to His purpose. I close with these words from Jonathan Edwards. Jonathan Edwards, you will know him as the pastor God used in New England to begin the first great revival in America, the Great Awakening as it came to be called. Great pastor just out of Boston. Jonathan Edwards, in his journal, at 19 years of age, wrote these words. I often hear people in old age say how they would live if they could live their lives over again. At 19, I resolved that I will live my life backwards. I will live as I wished I would have lived my life if I could have begun in old age. A time to be born, a time to die. You can keep fighting life, but you're never going to win. Or you can go to the very end of life and say, God, you're in control. I'm going to throw down my arms. No resistance. No advice. Yieldedness. What do you want your servant to learn? Speak, Lord, thy servant heareth. Shall we bow our heads in prayer? Father, as we come to you this morning, we realize that life is actually a maze. It's often a series of chapters that are like pieces of a puzzle. We see rough edges. We see poor distinction of what's going on. We see colors that are vague and we just can't discern what we're looking at. But Father, we realize that from an eternal perspective, we will look back on the very experiences that we struggled the most with, and we will see your hand teaching us something that is important from an eternal perspective. Deliver us from the bondage of time that seeks control, that must achieve its ends, accomplish its goals, gain a name for itself, failing to realize that we're part of a worldwide plan. We're part of an all-time consuming plan. We're part of an eternal plan. And Father, your call to us is to be a servant and a learner, not a driver, not a resistor, not a rebel. In Jesus' name we pray.